Hello from us too. I'm Katerina Soku. I'm a Washington, D.C. correspondent for Greek media and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted to be joined here today by Nikos Tsafos, a friend from Washington, D.C. Until recently, he was the Schlesinger Chair for Energy and Geopolitics at CSIS. He's been an advisor to governments, companies, banks in 30 countries on complex energy projects. And we're delighted to have you here with us, Nico, to talk about the strategies to tackle the energy crisis. And if I may refer to your analyst hat, if we're trying to define this energy crisis, how would you define it as an energy expert? And I guess adjacent to that, how long do you think it's going to take to resolve this crisis?
Well, thank you, Katerina. Thank you, everyone, for being here, the organizers for having me. This is an incredibly complex crisis, and I think the best way to understand it is in the following ways. First, it's multi-layered and multi-fuel. It's oil, it's gas, it's coal, it's electricity. In earlier or other energy crises, one of the ways you manage is you switch between the fuel that is hurting you to other fuels. At this moment, a huge chunk of our energy system is under enormous stress. And so that creates a complexity that is usually absent from other energy crises. I think that's one dimension. The second dimension is what we've seen on the price front is unprecedented. We have seen in the span of 1 year an increase in prices that is greater than the two oil shocks combined that happened over a 7-8 year period. And this crisis has been sort of reinforced by different ways of pricing energy, right? So until recently in Europe, we priced our energy off oil. So whatever the price of oil did, the price of gas did. Now we price our energy at exchanges and hubs, which means there is a new dynamic of how scarcity converts and manifests itself in price. The same thing for electricity. The price of electricity in many countries has gone up 5, 6, 7, 8 times. The overall cost to generate electricity has not gone up 6, 7, 8 times, but it is because of the structure that we use to price electricity that these increases are happening. So that's dimension number 2. And I think dimension number 3 is the imperative of the energy transition and climate change. So obviously we are seeing climate stress impacting our energy systems, the reliability of those systems. We're seeing that in many countries. But we also need to find solutions to this crisis that are consistent with our medium and long-term targets for the transition. And again, if you look at it as an analyst, in the past, you had a problem with gas, you went to coal. You had a problem with oil, you went to gas. Now, we need to sort of go to new fuels and industries that we have to create. We're not going to just go back to our old fuels. So, one example is the European Union has very ambitious targets on hydrogen. Well, we have to build the hydrogen industry. It's not just about pushing the button and a hydrogen industry appears. So I think that complexity makes navigating this crisis incredibly difficult. How long it's going to last, I don't know. What I do know is public policy and our choices will make a big difference. What countries decide, and more importantly, what the European Union decides to do is going to make a big difference on whether this is a crisis that lasts for a short term or is a crisis that lasts much longer. And so that's why I'm in this job, because I'm a believer in the role that government can play to shape this environment in a way that gets us out of this crisis as quickly as possible.
Okay, let's get to the policy proposals then. And of course, there is a big meeting at the European Council today of the energy ministers. And as the chief energy advisor to the Prime Minister of Greece and an energy expert, what would you like to see come out of this meeting today in both capacities and ideally being much, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think one of the important things to understand, and or at least that I see that I'm heartened by, is it seems that more and more European countries see the need for action. The Greek government, the Greek prime minister, has been talking about interventions for a long time, and I think we as a government are very happy when we are in Brussels. I was in Brussels earlier this week to see more and more governments say, you know what, we weren't sure, but things are getting really difficult and we need to do something. So one overarching hope I have is for decisive action at the EU level. It may not be all my wish list. That's not how Europe works. But I think decisive action is what I'm looking for, very big picture. On the specific ideas, there's a lot of things being discussed in Brussels right now. I'm going to focus on two main areas. One is on the electricity sector, the other is on natural gas. On electricity, our main problem for the past year and a half or year has been that the high price of natural gas has brought up the price of electricity. Why? Because we price electricity at the margin. High price of gas means high price of electricity, even if the cost of all the other technologies hasn't gone up or hasn't gone up as much. And so the real interest has been, how do you decouple those two things? How do you prevent the high gas price from bringing up the electricity price? And there are different ways to do this. In Greece, we've chosen one path, which basically says each technology by regulatory decree is allowed to earn a certain amount of money. And the price could be X. If your cost is X minus 50, that 50 goes to the state to support consumers. And so this is actually an idea that now the European Commission has put on the table with some modifications, but it's essentially saying that we should have gas be its own thing, and we should have other technologies that are enjoying excess revenues because of the high gas price. We shouldn't let those technologies keep all those revenues. We should let them keep some. So in some ways, on the electricity side of things, we're very heartened by the discussion at the EU level. We think we have a good model. We appreciate that Europe has recognized this. And obviously on the electricity side, we have the urgent need to talk about how do we reduce demand? How do we create more savings? And there's also a big discussion on the financialization of markets is creating a huge exposure now as firms are called by their bankers to put more and more money down. So trying to make sure that we have a good picture of that risk and a good strategy for managing that risk. So that's one part of the conversation happening in Brussels. And I think it's going in the direction that a Greek government is happy with. On the natural gas side, the Greek government has been from the beginning very vocal about the need to intervene in the natural gas market. What we have seen in the proposals from the president of the Commission and from various member states is an idea to put a cap on Russian gas. This is something that, on the one hand is very, it puts the idea of intervention on the table, which is very welcome because we've been advocates of intervention. But in our view, what is required is a more holistic solution. If we put a cap on Russian gas and who knows how Russia will respond to that. The real issue is the price of gas overall, not just the price of Russian gas. So when we look at our economic balances, when we look at our fiscal space, what matters is the price of gas, not just the price of Russian gas. The price of Russian gas matters, obviously, in terms of revenues to Russia. But from an economic perspective, what is more important is containing sort of the fallout in the gas market. So we have tabled views on a more direct intervention on TTF, the reference price for European gas. We have put on the table one model. Italy has put on the table a different model. Belgium has put on the table a slightly different model. The Commission has put on the table. So there's a lot of discussions happening around how best to do it. The two major concerns, and having spent most of my week talking about this topic and with different governments, the two main concerns is, if you do it, can you still secure supply? Will supply still come to Europe? And the second one is, if we do this, might you have an incentive for more gas consumption, and therefore you might not get the savings? So, and those are legitimate concerns. We're trying to work through those arguments and convince the other member states that those are risks that we can manage. And I think the main message that we are trying to convey as a government is, when you compare these proposals, compare them to the realistic alternative. Don't compare them to an idealized version of the market that doesn't exist anymore. So when people say, well, we'll be able to secure gas and LNG, the response is, we might not be able to secure as much gas as we want, even if we don't have a price cap, if we have demand in Asia be very robust, or if the lockdowns in China stop. So there is a risk, not just of action, but also of inaction. And it's really important to weigh those two things together.
Okay, so in this environment, Greece is relatively in a good position compared to other European countries. And I'm wondering, of course, you've set out your own national response, Greece has, to the energy crisis, which, among others, and you recently wrote an article about that. One is obviously to secure the supply you need for winter, where arguably Greece is in a better position right now than many other countries. But also you've had this market intervention, the windfall tax, to support the consumers. Can you talk a little bit more in more depth about this approach, how it's working, and how long you expect it to last?
Yeah, so let's begin with security of supply. So we look at, as the Greek government, we look at gas a little bit differently than the rest of Europe. In Europe, on average, 1/3 of gas is used in power, 1/3 in industry, 1/3 in buildings. In Greece, 70% of the gas goes to power generation. So when you look at a European level, you have a multi-sector fuel. In Greece, really the majority of the gas goes to one sector, electricity generation. So very much of our thinking is on the interdependence between gas and electricity rather than sort of gas on its own. That's one. The second thing is, we are one of a handful of countries in the European Union that has enough regasification, so LNG import capacity, that matches our consumption. Now, this is on an annual basis. It doesn't mean it's easy to, but it means we have much more sort of capacity to import LNG in case Russian supplies are interrupted, which they have not been to Greece as of yet. So those two things mean that we look at the market a little bit differently. We have done a number of things to strengthen our security. The minister, in his video message, referred to some of them, the FSU, the floating storage unit at Revithousa, being one of them. But the key thing that I want to convey in terms of our energy security, the EU has put a target for a 15% reduction in gas consumption. We've had a huge response from our industrial players switching from gas to naphtha, to oil. We have seen a huge growth in renewable energy, about 20% in the first 7 months of the year. And we are actually right now, about 50% of our electricity is wind, solar, water. And thirdly, we have, of course, put forward a plan to increase temporarily the generation from lignite. To give you a sense of the magnitude, we're going to go from about 5 terawatt hours to 10, which sounds very big. It is a big increase. We used to be at 30, right? So we've gone from 30 to 5, and we're going to go to 10 for a couple of years. So if you put all those things together, it more than covers the 15%. Now, some things may not work out. The lignite may be slower. Renewables, we never know. So it's not a reason to be sort of complacent, but it means that we look at a supply-demand balance that is that we've seen the demand respond significantly. We've also, on the supply side, significantly reduced our dependence on Russian gas. It used to be about 2/3 a few years ago. Last year it was 40. This year it's even lower than that. So, we are very vigilant. We continue to look at what might happen in the winter. We continue to do our contingency planning for managing the physical supply into Greece. But as you said, if you look at Greece relative to every other European country, we are on sort of the countries that you'd classify as in a better position than others. Now let's talk about the interventions in the market, because even if you have physical supply, you still have very high prices. So we've done a number of things from the beginning of this crisis to support different categories of consumers, the fuel pass, money to vulnerable households, and a number of things over the last few months, the support for diesel and other things. Obviously, the most significant, especially recently, has been our intervention in the electricity market. And what is interesting there is we are giving a lot of money to support electricity bills or support consumers to be able to afford electricity bills. But a lot of that money comes from the mechanism that we have put in place for windfall profits in the electricity sector. So to give you a sense, in August, we probably spent about 1.2 billion euros on electricity bills or electricity bill support. Only a little bit over 200 million came from the budget. The rest came from the system, either the windfall profits or the CO2 taxes. So that means that even though we're giving a lot of support, we're using the energy system itself to generate revenues that can, obviously we have economic targets, we have fiscal targets. And so what I can tell you is that we are constantly thinking about how to get support that is more tailored, that we can afford as a country, being very thoughtful about what's working, what's not working, what is needed. What we did in March or June may not be the same thing that we need to do in September and October. So we continue to refine our approach as the facts on the ground change, and I think that's a fair thing. The last thing I'll say on that is, I think there's a lot of debate around, prices need to reflect the cost, and consumers will respond to higher prices, which I think is a fair comment. And it is absolutely essential that if we're going to have savings, consumers see some of the increase in the cost of electricity. But it's really important to go back to my initial comment. The electricity bill is going up 6-7 times. The overall cost to generate electricity has not gone up 6-7 times. This is largely an artifact of how we structure these markets. So I think it's also a question of fairness. It's one thing to say you consume a good, the cost to produce this good has gone up 6 times, you have to pay 6 times more. That's not what's happening here. The price of the good has gone up 6-7 times because of the structure of the market. And so I think it's also a question of fairness to say that we should try to correct this sort of distortion in the market, rather than just saying, well, this is the price that comes out. I'm a very big believer that, energy markets, we keep tinkering with them because we have to get them right. And, we've gone through a number of different versions of how we price oil, how we price gas, how we price electricity. And the reason we keep tinkering is because whatever we have at some point shows its weakness, and you have to come up with a new system that is tailored for the moment that's coming or the moment you're in. And so that's very much the philosophy of this government, is to try to figure out, what is working, what is not working, and what can we afford, what is fair, how do you get the support to those who need it the most, and try to adjust as you go along as the crisis changes.
Okay, I'd like to focus a little bit more on the security of supply and ask you about a potential stop of Russian energy flowing to Southeast Europe. Given that the geopolitical tensions are still very alive and active, we cannot exclude it. And I'm assuming that you're having your own exercises on the table of how you might react to that. How would Greece respond to such a situation? Is it well prepared to handle this? And a similar question would be, and it was asked before to the energy ministers of Southeast Europe, how long before we don't need Russian energy anymore?
Yeah, so I am not going to give you my forecast of whether we're going to have Russian gas this winter. What I will tell you is that from the day I started this job, which is not too long ago, my number one priority has been assuming no Russian gas, what happens and how can we deal with this? I don't know what will happen. What I want to do is I want to make sure that can we look at our system without Russian gas and what are the vulnerabilities, what are the challenges that we have. And so it takes us back to the discussion we were having that for Greece, 70% of gas goes to electricity. And so the consumption of gas for heating in households is only a very small portion of the overall market. All the distribution networks are about 18% in 2021. The households are probably around 10% plus or minus. So the security of supply for the household sector is not a huge part of the concern. Price is a different thing. So for us, the main thing has been, how do we secure the electricity sector? Because it is through the electricity, it is in the electricity sector that the vast majority of our gas is consumed. So that has put us on an exercise to look at the electricity sector and what we can do. So what are we doing? One, we are increasing our production of lignite. That's going to take a little bit of time to ramp up. Number two, we've had preparations for some of the power plants that can use alternative fuel, which means oil, to be able to switch to those alternative fuels. We have the growth of renewable energy. Trust me, I know that the impression in the Greek public is that it's going to be lignite that saves us this winter. I think it's going to be wind and the sun. And in fact, if we have good renewable output, the picture for Greece looks much, much better. We have very good, unlike the rest of Europe, our stocks at reservoir levels on hydro are actually quite good coming out of the summer. So that gives us a good buffer in contrast to the rest of Europe that has seen big droughts and there are shortages. There isn't enough water, and so that's the overall picture. The key thing is, if you don't have Russian gas, we're going to rely on our pipeline gas from Azerbaijan. We're going to rely on LNG. Some of that gas will also go north. I'm sure we'll talk about that since this is a regional forum, but let me just focus on Greece for a second. So the question is, without the degrees of freedom that Russian gas gives you, you need to operate the system very optimally, right? And there's a lot of things we don't know. We don't know what kind of a winter we're going to have. Is it going to be very cold or is it going to be mild? We don't know, as I said, hydro output. We don't know how our electricity system, especially older units, are going to perform under stress. So there's a lot of things we don't know. What we are trying to do is make sure that we have as much contingency as possible and that we understand exactly what the weakness of the system are and trying to find ways to strengthen the system where possible. How long will it take? I think the answer I would have given you, 6 months ago is, multiple years that it would take for us to be able to say that we live without Russian gas. The reality is that if we have to live without Russian gas now, that is just the reality, right? So we've seen Europe withstand a huge decrease in Russian gas flows. And so the reality is that the question of how long it will take is almost becoming sort of academic, because the phase out of Russian gas is being forced on Europe sort of much faster than Europe would have chosen. It doesn't affect this part of Europe yet and a few other countries. But the reality is that, the change in flows has been sort of much more dramatic than I think anyone anticipated when this war started.
And a related question to that, how much energy conservation would be required in such a scenario of a sudden stop of Russian gas. I mean, I just this past week, there were initiatives for government buildings and authorities to scale down on their energy consumption. This is voluntary for now. Do you expect that this would be something that would need to be ramped up in a scenario like that?
I mean, look, the easiest way to balance any system is through reducing energy consumption in a reasonable way, right? I think the word reasonable is important, right? Because if you can't afford energy, we shouldn't call that energy savings, right? Energy savings is still being able to get the benefits of energy but consuming less. So I think there's a fine line between what is savings and what is just forced savings. Our view is that we are going to try to get savings where we can. I think as we go into the winter, we're going to see a ramp up of a public education sort of campaign of best ways to conserve energy. I think the reality is that Greek consumers have experience with periods of time when our system has come under stress, and so it's not unfamiliar to them to experience moments where we say, can you please reduce, because otherwise we'll have to curtail supply. Our goal is to not have to curtail supply, obviously, but it all depends on a number of factors that we can't know right now, which is what will happen to Russian gas, what the weather is going to be, the performance of our system. But reducing consumption is definitely going to be one of our goals. And one of the things actually that we've done, there are sort of two ways to reduce consumption. And if I put on my energy analyst hat, I will tell you that anything that depends on humans doing things is less reliable than anything that depends on machines. So one of the things we did is we spent money to support consumers who wanted to replace energy-intensive appliances at their homes, right? I very much trust the fuel-efficient refrigerator to use less energy than the refrigerator you just threw out. Then I trust individuals to turn off the light, to keep an eye on the thermostat every hour. So there is a system response that we invested in. And I wish we could have done sort of more because there was a lot of demand for this kind of product. But you have scarce resources; you have to think about where to put them. So it's not something that we're not thinking about. It's something that we're trying to pair public education as well as targeted investments that we know have a visible impact on consumption because they sort of rewire the system.
And I would assume this also means that you don't mess with industrial production either. You don't want to end up in a recession just because they can't use electricity anymore. But Eva, I think we need to wrap up. And I do want to go to the last question, which is Greece's role in the region. After all, as you said, this is a conference, a forum about Southeast Europe, and the role that Greece can play on regional integration and diversifying the energy resources of the region. How do you see Greece's role, how it has progressed, and how focused is this current Greek government on that particular issue? Where do you see it helping?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say more broadly, interconnections are a lifeline. They are, there's a lot of criticism that Europe didn't do anything after the 2006 and 2009 crises. I don't think that's a fair characterization. We saw a huge increase in our capacity to import LNG and the capacity to move that gas to where it's needed. So the map looks very different today than it did 15 years ago. And that is absolutely the case for this part of the continent as well. Right now we are, supplying Bulgaria. And, Bulgaria is one of the countries that was one of the first to get cut off from Russia. So that connectivity has been absolutely essential. And interestingly enough, this is happening even before we have IGB fully operational, before we have the FSRU in Alexandroupoli. And so what is really interesting to me is, I get to, sit with the prime minister when foreign leaders come. And it's remarkable just how many foreign leaders from the region, in particular, when they come, they want to talk about energy and try to figure out, how do you move energy and particularly gas around in an optimal way. And so I think the question for us is, how do we make smart investments? How do we bring partners from the region who will benefit from these investments to participate in these projects? And also how we think about the role of Greece, not just in natural gas, but also in electricity. Think about, we are very well connected sort of north and west, but we need to build our connectivity south. And also thinking about new energy carriers like hydrogen eventually. So, connectivity is, if you look at the European energy system right now, the number one problem is connectivity. You can bring a lot of gas to Spain, but you can't push it in. You can bring gas to the UK and you can't really push it in. There's a huge gap between the price on the water and the price inland, and that reflects bottlenecks in infrastructure. And so, this investment is, the tough things that you always sort of, it took, 10 years for the FSRU in Alexandroupolis to sort of happen, right? So you're very happy when you've done it, but it takes a long time for all the obstacles to be overcome and for the necessary things to come together. But we're very focused on this because we see the significance that our position has for the energy security of our neighbors. And I can tell you this comes up in every sort of discussion that I'm in with regional partners.
Beautiful, and I'd like to close on that note and on the fact that the crisis should also be used as an opportunity for the energy transition and thinking ahead on how to get there rather than just focus on the crisis management that we need to do right now. Thank you very much, Nico.
Thank you.
And please join us for lunch. It's being served outside.